الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. We have reached the 35th aphorism from this blessed collection of aphorisms that are so foundational to what it is that the Sadiq needs to know about the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And every single one of these aphorisms is precious, and they are beautiful gems of wisdom that teach us the way that you and I need to be and what it is that we need to focus on if indeed we're going to take the path of drawing near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seriously. And of everything that it is that a human being can seek, there is nothing better to possibly seek than closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of the different human pursuits, everything that is that someone can do or seek or to pursue or to seek after, nothing is better, nothing is loftier than to seek closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And nothing requires that you give more of yourself than giving yourself to the path and giving yourself over ultimately to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you do so, there's no reward. And think about what you have to do to start your own company. Think about what you have to do to get some type of degree, let alone some type of postgraduate degree. Think about what it is that you have to do if you want to serve some cause and dedicate yourself to it. And the amount of energy that is put in, the blood, sweat, and tears, and the way that you think about it. And anyone that's done like a PhD dissertation knows that you have to think about it in the middle of the night. You have to think about it when you're in the shower. You have to think about it in the morning. And ultimately, you have to be freed up to give it your all. And then you're going to write something that maybe 200 people read, and that's it. The point is that think about in a worldly sense what it is that people give up and sacrifice for something that is worldly in nature. And what we really should be willing to do is sacrifice for this, traveling the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in this aphorism that Ibn Ata'illah al-Sikandari radiallahu ta'ala anhu wa nafa'ana bih, he wants to teach us something about the source of two things that we all know. One we need to do and the other we need to avoid. And so he wants us to teach us what is the source of ma'asiyah, of wrong action, and what is the source of the opposite of ma'asiyah, which is ta'ah, obedience. And he wants us to understand very clearly so that you and I can then tread the path to be people of obedience and to at all costs avoid anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and everything that Allah ta'ala has prohibited. So he says, Aslu kulli ma'siyatin wa ghaflatin wa shahwatin ar-rida an nafs. The source of all disobedience, heedlessness, and desire is self-satisfaction. Wa aslu kulli ta'atin wa yaqadatin wa iffatin عدم الرضا منك عنها. The source of all obedience, wakefulness, and temperance, or like restraint, is dissatisfaction with oneself. وَلَأَن تَصْحَبْ جَاهِلًا لَا يَرْضَى عَنْ نَفْسِهِ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنْ أَن تَصْحَبْ عَالِمًا يَرْضَى عَنْ نَفْسِهِ. It is better for you to keep the company of an ignorant man who is dissatisfied with himself than to keep the company of a learned man who is satisfied with himself. فَأَيُّ عِلْمٍ لِعَالِمٍ يَرْضَى عَنْ نَفْسِهِ. For what knowledge does a learned man who is self-satisfied actually have? وَأَيُّ جَهْلٍ لِجَاهِلٍ لَا يَرْضَى عَنْ نَفْسِهِ. And what ignorance does an ignorant man who is dissatisfied with himself really have? So there is so much here. And we can essentially summarize this in a very basic way, in a bridge fashion, by saying dissatisfaction with oneself is the source of all obedience. And so, like usual, we're going to begin with a linguistic breakdown, inshallah ta'ala, looking at these words a little bit more closely. And so the word asl can be translated as source. It's also the foundation of something. You could think of it in terms of the roots, or even that basis upon which something is built, and then what branches from it is that what comes from that asl. So you can talk about the asl and then the fara'. But here I think source works really well. And then we have the word kulli. Kulli means, of course, all or everything related to that thing. Aslu kulli ma'siyah. So the source of every type of disobedience, all disobedience. And ma'siyah here is simply understood as mukhalafat amrillah al-wajib. When Allah commands you to do something, is that you to refrain to do it. Or He prohibits you from doing something and you do it. That's essentially what ma'siyah is. You've contravened the divine command, either by doing something you shouldn't do or avoiding something you should have done. And then we have these two words, ghafla and shahwa. Ghafla is translated as heedlessness. And it's a lack of awareness. And it could even be described in Arabic as al-i'rad, turning away from something. And then shahwa is your desire, your caprice, your passion, doing what it is that your nafs wants and giving it what it seeks and what it is calling to. So, aslu kulli ma'siyatin wa ghaflatin wa shahwatan. And this wow that is an atf here, it's the conjunction, i.e. that joins this meaning of ghafla and shahwa to what precedes it. Here, as the scholars have say, it's min atf sabab ala al-musabbab. And what that means is it is joining that which is a cause of something to its effect. So even though that it's mentioned after it, i.e. ghafla and shahwa, which are heedlessness and desire, those two things are the cause of the ma'siyah. So the effect is actually mentioned first, and then you have the cause is mentioned after it. So ar-rida here can be translated as satisfaction, being pleased with something, being content with something. And I think satisfaction probably works best here because we have this idea of self-satisfaction, where you're content. You don't think that you need anything. You don't think that you need working on. You're happy right where you are. And in nafs, of course, here is in the lower sense, your ego, the side of you that needs working on. So as he tends to do, he oftentimes juxtaposes the one phrase to another or one word to another, and sometimes multiple times in one statement. So after mentioning that, then he tells us about its opposite. وَأَصْلُ كُلِّ طَاعَةٍ. So here we have the word asl again, the source of every ta'ah. So ta'ah is juxtaposed to ma'siyah. Ta'ah is obedience. And that is obeying the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then yaqadha, which is actually to be in a wakeful state, as opposed to someone who's na'im, someone yaqidh, they're awake, someone who's na'im, someone who's sleeping. Here, wakefulness in the sense of awareness. And here it's the opposite of ghafla. Ghafla is heedlessness, and yaqadha is wakefulness in the sense of awareness, watching over your heart. And then iffa. So he juxtaposes iffa to shahwa. And so shahwa, again, is just your desires, doing whatever it is that you want, whatever your nafs calls you to. Whereas iffa is about restraint. It's about abstaining. And this word temperance is a very important word because it's one of the 4 cardinal virtues. And when that's balanced, i.e. the faculty that trait stems from, it leads to a number of other virtues. And one of the ways they explain iffah, which is really beautiful, in Arabic is so rich, they say, ulul himmati an shahawat, where your desire, your aspiration becomes so strong, you're no longer caged by your desires. Your lofty aspirations and what you set that heart on and what it is that you're traveling towards is so lofty that you are willing to give up what your nafs wants. And this is what they've always said, is that whoever knows what the goal really is, it's easy for him to sacrifice everything that is that he sacrifices. When we know the goal, and were we only to realize the fruits that we receive in this world, in the beginning, let alone in the middle or the end of the path, were we only to know, it would be easy for us to make the greatest of sacrifices. And you can't really ever truly be healthy if you don't have religion. And you can't truly ever be healthy unless you excel in religion. It's the source of everything. And if people claim to be happy in a worldly sense, it won't last. At some point, they will be unhappy. Because the world cannot fulfill you. It will not and cannot fulfill you. And even though everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame, and they look at these people that have wealth and riches and all of these things that they're given here, and they think that they're happy, and that's what that's striving to, it's all a facade and a complete mirage. It won't and it can't ever fulfill you. And it's not that someone who is very advanced in the spiritual path can't be unhealthy in a different way. But they could have physical ailments. They could have other things that have gone wrong with them. But ultimately, health begins here. Ultimately, health begins here. And the people of this science are the true doctors and physicians of the soul. And I remember learning meanings of the great masters of the spiritual path. Our teachers will often say, هذا الطبيب حاذق. This is a skillful physician, where he is that operating on you by these beautiful words that they are putting together from hearts that are radiant with the light of Iman. And they touch our hearts. And think about how many people have read this text. Think about how many thousands and hundreds of thousands and maybe in the millions of awliya read these same words that you and I are reading. Thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not in the millions of awliya. And all of the subsequent centuries after this great Imam. And as we mentioned, this is considered like the constitution of the spiritual path. And yes, that he had a particular spiritual path, but it's read that across the spiritual paths because it's so important. And he, in a sense, that systematized what it is that the Sadiq, the one voyaging to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, needs. So, what does he say here? This all gets back to ar-rida and nafs, self-satisfaction or dissatisfaction of oneself. And again, we're speaking about this at this level in a spiritual sense, although the same applies for everything. And it's one of the preconditions of mastery of anything, is that you are dedicated to putting in energy time and time again into the mastery of that particular thing. And once you think that you've learned enough or you have enough, you now are unable to grow. And no one in their right mind will think that. And people have tapped into that and they're using it for dunya. They're using it for dunya in different ways. And not all of those things are bad. Some of them are used for bad purposes, but not all of those things are bad. But if you're using it for the quest to become the best basketball player ever, okay, great. In the end of the day, what is the big deal about some ball that going through some little circle? I like playing basketball, but in the end, it's meaningless. And it doesn't mean that we don't play sports or encourage children to do sports, especially in our time. and to try to teach them certain things through sports, that's a whole different topic. But in the end, it's meaningless. Who cares? What does it matter? Even if you have a stadium and that's full of 30, 40,000 people, in the end, it's useless. What really matters is the state of our heart and the way we understand these meanings in the spiritual sense. And much of the wisdom being used, again, across the spectrum in all of these different spheres of these books that sell on Amazon and bookstores like Barnes and Nobles and so forth, and are used as self-help or leadership books or like for teaching people corporate principles or whatever. A lot of it is that rooted in religious principles, but it's been shaved and it's been repackaged and presented oftentimes for solely worldly purposes. And it's the lost property of the believer, and we can benefit from it. But we have a whole tradition. And alhamdulillah that I've heard a good portion of this text taught by my teacher. And that is being taught a second time. And this text has been taught with an unbroken chain back to the author itself. From realized masters. This is not something that is flimsy. This is something that is very real. And when you take these meanings from their true source, that's when they truly benefit you. And that's when they start to seep into the heart. So, ar-rida here, satisfaction. And then he says, وَلَأَنْ. This is the lam al-ibtida. الداخلة على الأن المصدرية. وَلَأَنْ تَصْحَبْ جَاهِلًا. So it has the meaning of صُحْبَتك, right? It's like having a masdar there, verbal noun. That you're keeping the company of. So صاحب يصحب is to keep the company of, to take the companionship of someone. وَلَأَنْ تَصْحَبْ جَاهِلًا. A jahil is someone who doesn't know. In here, what is specifically meant is someone who doesn't have in-depth knowledge of the sacred law. So they're not as knowledgeable as the scholar. So this is not just any jahil. This means specifically someone who is not as knowledgeable of the sacred law. So for you to take the companionship and keep the company of someone who's jahil, ignorant, or you could say who doesn't have as much knowledge, might be a better way of phrasing that. La yarda an nafsihi, who is dissatisfied with himself. Khayrun laka. Khayrun is better than, yani afdal, it's better for you. Laka, for you. Min an tasab, than for you to keep the company of an aliman. An aliman is a scholar, a knowledgeable person, someone who knows the sacred law and has studied the sciences. Yarda an nafsih, than a learned man who is satisfied with himself. And when we say satisfied, we'll have to unpack that a little bit more. We're just still in the linguistic breakdown. And then he poses a question. فَأَيُّ عِلْمٍ لِعَالِمٍ. In what knowledge, ilm is knowledge, does the alim have who yarda an nafsih, that is self-satisfied? What knowledge does he really have? وَأَيُّ جَهْلًا. And what ignorance does this quote-unquote ignorant man, la yarda an nafsi, who is dissatisfied with himself, actually have? And this is a question that is rhetorical in nature, and he wants to convey a specific meaning that we'll get to bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So let's look at some of the meanings, insha'Allah ta'ala. So if we look at this phrase here, we obviously are learning that ar-rida an nafs, being satisfied with yourself, being content with where you are, is a very serious thing. And what ends up happening is we become veiled as a result of thinking that we don't need work, let alone if we think that we're special, let alone if we think that we're self-sufficient. So it's enough of an evil, spiritually speaking, to think that you don't need work. let alone to be full of yourself. And just think about the difficulties and how practical this is and beneficial this is for the world in which we live, which is literally just pumping our egos day in and day out. And everything around us in the society is pumping our ego up. And it's our job to deflate it and to be wary of the tendencies around us. And the modern means of technology for that have made it easier for people that might have been egoless, but now sitting in the corner of their home, and because their people are giving them likes around the world, all of a sudden, they're having feelings that they've never had before. And all it takes is to praise someone just a little bit, and khalas. And people that lose their bearings. So we really want to hone in on this, and that know the danger of being satisfied with ourselves. And so when that we look at these three terms, disobedience, ghafla, and shahwa, what the scholars say is that one leads to another. So one of the ways that we can look at this is ghafla, which is heedlessness. When we're not aware, this means we will approve of our state. And if you're unaware of your state and you're approving of your own self, and you don't think that you need working on, you're not going to be alert. You're not going to be attentive. If you are just comfortable and you drop your guard, you're not going to think something's going to happen. Whereas if you're alert and you're aware of something, you're going to be on guard. And we can think of a worldly metaphor very easily. If there's some imminent danger, you're going to be on guard. But if there's safety, you drop your guard and everything's fine and so forth. This is the state of our hearts. When we are in a state of heedlessness, we drop our guard and we fail to be conscious specifically of our khawatir, the thoughts that come to our heart. And when we fail to be conscious of the thoughts that come to our heart, we sometimes fall victim to the desires that arise from various thoughts that come. So that ghafla leads to the shahwa. And then you have certain thoughts, and thoughts depending upon the state of our nafs, whether it's an ammara, or lawama, or mutma'inna, the three stages. If it's in a lower state, if you have a desire to do something that's impermissible, you might incline towards it. And that's why you have to struggle against yourself. As your soul starts to become more and more pure, you still might have thoughts about doing something wrong, but it's repulsive to you. And you still have to work on yourself, but that's a better state to be in. And then if you put enough work in, those thoughts don't even come to your heart anymore. And those represent the three different stages of thoughts that are towards things. But thoughts could also be for things that are within the realm of the permissible. So it doesn't have to be necessarily something that's haram. It could be something that's makruh. It could be something that's permissible. In shaitan, if he can't get you to do something haram, he's cunning like a fox. He's going to try to get you to do something that's disliked. And if he can't, he's going to try to get you to go into excess. And he knows if he can get you to eat a lot on the night of Ramadan, for instance, and so forth and so on. And then a whole bunch of other things can happen. So he works indirectly. And he's sometimes way ahead of the game. Because he knows that if he can get you to do this, then you can do this and you can do that. And he works in khutawat. He works in steps. And he doesn't take you into something that's severe right away. And even in terms of that a lot of different things. It starts just with one little thing. And it leads to another. And leads to another. So, if we lack awareness and we're not watching over our heart, we're not vigilant, then we're not going to be able to control our thoughts. And we're going to be trapped in our desires as a result. And it will derail us. Will derail us. And all of this stems from the state of heedlessness and desire. But even more fundamental than that is being in a state of mind where we don't think that we need working on to begin with. So in other words, if we don't feel this imminent need to work upon ourselves and to prepare for the meeting with Allah, we're just going to be in a complete state of heedlessness. And if you're not using your aql, you're just following your desires. And then the next thing we know is that we're doing things that the very few things that Allah Ta'ala has told us not to do. There's no need to do anything wrong. Allah has given us so many permissive alternatives. Why would we ever do anything that was wrong? So this is really where is what he's trying to get at. And they have what is called the Ayn al-Rida and the Ayn al-Sukht or al-Sakht. And the Ayn al-Rida is the eye of contentment or satisfaction. And the Ayn al-Sukht or al-Sakht is the eye of displeasure. And one of the poets famously said, وَعَيْنَ الرِّضَى عَنْ كُلِّ عَيْبٍ كَلِيلَةٌ. The eye of contentment fails to see any fault. Kalila, you can't see it. وَلَكِنْ عَيْنَ السُّخْرِ تُبْدِي الْمُسَاوِيَةِ. But the eye of discontent manifests all the wrong that someone has. And so we know very clearly, if someone doesn't like you, they're going to focus on your faults. And if people like you, they tend not to notice your faults. It's very, very simple. People like you, they tend to be veiled from your faults. Or just, okay, we'll put it aside. If they just don't like you for whatever reason, they have an aversion towards you, oh, careful. They're not going to notice the 99 things you do. They're going to focus on that one thing. Okay, this is the nature of people. This is the way that it works. But forget about people. The purpose here is to focus on our own selves. How do we look at our own self? Your nafs is you. But sometimes we think of it as a different person. Your nafs is you. How do we look at our own nafs? Do we just look at it with the ayn al-rida? Like, oh, look at me. Ujub is a very serious thing. Vanity, that this delusory state where we're so impressed with ourselves. It is an incredible veil, and a very subtle veil that's even more subtle than a riya, more subtle than ostentation and showing off. And again, there's things that this doesn't mean. We're speaking about this now solely in a spiritual context, and sometimes we have to bring the discourse down a little bit to explain what that doesn't mean. But if need be, we'll get to that inshallah ta'ala. But the point here is, we're not supposed to look at ourselves in a satisfactory way. We're supposed to see ourselves as having faults, as needing work on, so that we can then protect ourselves from being stung by that which will hurt us and ultimately veil us. And this is because our Prophet taught us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that our very worst enemy of all is our own self that is between our two sides. A'da aduwak. A'da. Ism tafdil. A'da aduwak. Your worst enemy, nafsuka allati bayna janbayk, is your own nafs that is between your two sides. Where is the Muslim ummah today in relation to this understanding? We point the finger so much. We that focus so much externally and everything that has been done to us and so forth. And we should know with absolute certainty, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala would never subjugate us to an external enemy except to the degree of our own weakness. And until we recognize that as an individual, family, community, and the entire ummah, we're never going to get out of the humiliation that we're in right now, worldwide. And so people could sit here and talk about and fault this science. They'd be like, you're sitting here talking about the heart, and Muslims are dying all over the world and all these things are happening. Precisely, this is what we're talking about because this is what's been lost. This is the source cure to everything. If people start focusing on what is it we've been taught to focus on and to learn our deen, and yes, take the asbab outwardly to do the things that need to be done to be able to live in this world in which we live, but from a principled perspective in a heart that is rooted in Iman, Islam, and Ihsan, then things will really change. But if we just put this aside, and there's this modernist tendency to do that, it's like, no, we need to be active. And oftentimes conscious neglect, and sometimes even making fun of people that spend their time learning these meanings or criticizing them or something. Where are we going to really get with that? If you can't control your own self, how can you control anything? If you can't govern yourself, how can you govern anything? If you can't prevent people from your own evil, you're going to think that you're helping something which is going to make things worse, and you make the waters murkier. So this is where it begins. And Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala teaches us in the Quran, وَمَا أُبَرِّئُ نَفْسِي, I do not claim myself to be innocent. This is how we should be. وَمَا أُبَرِّئُ نَفْسِي. Any type of conflict that we have with anyone, we should never ever think that it's 100% that person's fault. That is jahl. That is complete ignorance. We should never think that. Look internally. What did I do? What did I contribute? And for some temperaments, that's harder than others. For some people that tend to be a little bit more extroverted, it might be a little bit more difficult for them to be more introspective. And some people that are very controlling, it's very difficult for them to look internally and to put themselves into question. So this is very important. Inna nafs la'ammaratun bisu'. If any of us are claiming that our nafs is no longer calling to evil, there might be some nufus that are mutma'inna, but that takes a lot of work usually. This is the vast majority of people, the state that they're in. And Imam al-Wasiri in the Burda Sharif that we recite on a regular basis, what does he say? وَخَالِفِ النَّفْسَ وَالشَّيْطَانَ وَعْصِيهِمَا. Go against the nafs, go against shaitan, and disobey them both. وَإِنْهُمَا مَحَضَاقَ النُّصْحَ فَاتَّهِمِ. And even if it seems like they're giving you good advice, beware. Be wary. You got to be careful. And shaitan can come in the form of good eventually. And one of the best expositions of the thoughts is Imam al-Ghazali's exposition in Minhaj al-Abidin, The Path of the Worshippers, which is a book that should be on everybody's shelf. It's been translated by Mukhtar Holland, rahimahullah. وَلَا تُطِعْ مِنْهُمَا خَصْمًا وَلَا حَكَمًا فَانْتَتَعْرِيُ كَيْدَ الْخَصْمِ وَالْحَكَمِ. And as some of them said, that تَوَقَّ نَفْسَكَ لَا تَأْمِنْ غَوَائِلَهَا. Be wary of your own self and never feel safe from its plots. فَالنَّفْسُ أَخْبَثُ مِنْ سَبْعِينَ شَيْطَانًا. The nafs is more evil than 70 devils. That's the reality. Shaitan is an adu, he's an enemy. But as the poet said here, akhbath is fouler, more wicked, more evil than 70 shaitans. Where is that in terms of our understanding? Where is that in terms of our understanding? The vast majority of us who even are open to the meanings of the spiritual path don't actually see it like that. And the purpose here is not that we sit around and mope around in my nafs. No, it's to be wary of the guile of the nafs so that you can deal with it, so you can roll up your sleeves and deal with the daily battle. Do we not have a daily battle to wake up on time? And how many times do we press the snooze button? And do we even set that like in our alarms or not? Like a daily battle to control what it is that we eat, to control our tongue, to do it's a daily battle from morning until evening. There's times when we get tired, but we got to push along. There's times that we don't want to do something, but you got to do it. It's a daily battle. It is a daily battle and a very difficult daily battle indeed. But this is really what we should be doing, is rolling up our sleeves to do the work that we need to do to draw near to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And I want to quote just a few quotes of the righteous who came before us. And this is how, in a very real way, they viewed their own selves. قال Abu Hafs radiallahu ta'ala anhu, one of the great Salihin by the name, his kunya was Abu Hafs, may Allah be pleased with them. منذ 40 سنة اعتقادي في نفسي أن الله ينظر إلي نظر السخط وأعمالي تدل على ذلك. For 40 years, this is from the kibar of the awliya, that has amazing experiences and tastes the sweetness of prayer. He says, for 40 years, I believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is gazing upon me a gaze of displeasure, that I'm not in a good state before my Lord. And that my a'mad, the things that I do, all of my acts, my righteous deeds, all indicate that. So meaning it clearly means something different, because this doesn't mean that you have this self-pity where you don't do anything and don't think you can do anything. No, these are people that are acting. These are people that are doing righteous deeds throughout their day, all day, every day. And that have reached that high, but still this is how they view themselves. They're not sitting up there thinking that, oh, this is... And this is the difference between someone who is in a position of fame or leadership that has an unbridled ego. It's going to go to their head. If you're not actively, if you don't have the protection of faith and the protection of being connected to real shuyukh and the protection of that a criterion that Allah Ta'ala gives you by struggling upon the spiritual path and constantly turning to Him and seeking refuge in Him on a daily basis in the wee hours of the night, there's no way you're going to be protected. It's not going to happen. إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَهُ اللَّهُ. There's no way. And it's hard enough having faith, having a sheikh, doing those things on a daily basis to be safe, let alone if someone doesn't. But this is what they thought about themselves. And then Imam al-Junayd said, "La taskun ila nafsik." Sukun is where you just think that you're okay. Don't think you're okay. وَإِن دَامَتْ طَاعَتُهَا لَكَ فِي طَاعَةِ رَبَّكَ. Even if you outwardly seem to be only doing acts of obedience. La taskun. Don't rest. Don't think you're okay. Be wary. Be careful. Be attentive. وقال أبو سليمان الداراني ما رضيت عن نفسي طرفة عين. I have not been satisfied with myself for the blink of an eye. Wow. And Sayyidina Siriya Saqati, he says, I look at myself in the mirror several times a day. And here he's not looking himself in the mirror like the way that most people do, especially if they've worked out a little bit. All of a sudden they're taking selfies and looking at the different angles after they've been doing the bench press. And, why do they have mirrors in a lot of these gyms and seeing how the muscles are growing and all these different things that are happening, the pounds coming off and, can I fit into this or that and all this kind of stuff that people do, and obsessed with the physical body. You should be in good shape, but you shouldn't be obsessed with your physical body. And the Salihin look in the mirror very differently. He says, I was looking in the mirror because I feared that Allah Ta'ala was going to fill my face with darkness as a result of my disobedience. Like he's worried that he'd have darkness in his face. SubhanAllah. This is very real. This is how these people are. So what do we take from all of that? We recognize that we need working on. And we have to roll up our sleeves and be willing to put that work in. And take a path of learning the theory of this science. And to study it every single day of our lives. Tasawwuf, you have to study every day. We do the Roha once a week. The true people of Allah are reading these books every day, multiple times a day. And if you just go, for instance, where I studied and look at our teacher who taught us these works, there's probably 20 to 30 books that are of suluk that are being read with him on a daily basis from morning to evening. Because they sprinkle everything they do with knowledge, even lunchtime. Lunchtime consists of, okay, you're waiting for the lunch to come out, and different people are reading. And there might be 7 to 8 books that sections of each book are read, just waiting for lunch. And then after lunch, a little bit more. And then after Asr, there's more. And then there's other classes that take place at different times. And this is the way they are. They're studying this. That right now, I remember that our teacher is teaching on at least 4 different occasions, portions of the Ihya Ulumuddin. There was a weekly class in the Ihya Ulumuddin, and there was another class where it was 4 days a week that there was the Ihya Ulumuddin, and then there was another class that was 3 days a week where they're reading from the Ihya Ulumuddin, and then there's one class that once a month, at the end of one of these classes, that they read from the Ihya Ulumuddin, in different parts, and it's just constant. This is what we need to be like. When we get together and we go to people's homes for dinner, we should be reading from these books. We should bring this to life when we travel and so forth and so on. We need to read these books daily. But if we can't do it daily, at least once a week, we have to have a reminder here and there. But ideally, we have a book of tasawwuf by our nightstand or someplace where we know we sit regularly that we can read at least 5 to 10 minutes a day. All of us need that. In addition to some of the other lessons that we attend. So then he goes on to say, it is better for you to keep the company of an ignorant man who is dissatisfied with himself than to keep the company of a learned man who is satisfied with himself. And this is because of the effects of companionship. And if someone who is satisfied with himself is in a state of heedlessness, following their desires, and thus calling oftentimes to acts of disobedience, that's not a good state to be in, and it's going to affect you. Whereas if someone is aware that they need working on, and they are actively treading the spiritual path, even if they lack a little bit of that knowledge that some of these people have in relation to the outward rulings of the sacred law, you're going to be impacted by those people. And by virtue of that knowledge, it will be a means for you to have openings, even in relation to those things that you should know outwardly that you didn't learn outwardly. And having said that, we should balance and learn the outward of this religion and focus on the inward as well. What we really want is balance. But what he's teaching us here is we need to be careful about who it is that we spend our time with. And just because they have sacred knowledge doesn't mean that that's someone that you should necessarily spend time with. Make sure there's other things that check. They used to give us the criterion that one of the signs of the ulama as-su, the quote-unquote evil scholars, that they don't like the books of Imam al-Ghazali. So that's something you want to be careful of. If there are people who just don't like the books of Imam al-Ghazali, the advice of the people who came before us was be wary. If people that are actively just criticizing the people of Tasawwuf, you got to be careful. And one of the criterion for the scholars in Hadramaut why they liked Ibn Hajar and preferred him over Imam Ramli, even though both were great Shafi scholars. And there were other reasons as well, that his brilliance and his strength in hadith. One of them was that his difa' an Sufiya, is the way he defended the people of Tasawwuf and showed how they had, in many of the things that they did, the true people of Tasawwuf, of course, that some of the things which they did were misunderstood, finding for them proofs in the sacred law for the various things that they did. And there's a line of scholars that did that. The likes of Ibn Hajar, the likes of Imam Asyuti, the likes of Imam Sha'rani, and so forth and so on, where they show how this is understood in a religious context. And that's a very good sign. So we need to be careful about who it is that we spend our time with, because when we're with people who are not self-satisfied, and who are struggling with themselves and treading the spiritual path is that the blessing of their state will come upon you. And as they say, attiba tasriq attiba, is that your nature steals from the nature of those that you are around. Whether you like it or not, you're going to steal from their nature. In other words, you are impacted by the people you spend time with. And if you put yourself around good people, it's one of the best things you can possibly do. And you will naturally start to incline towards being like them. And what ultimately the type of knowledge that we want is the type of knowledge that leads to the lifting of the veils between us and Allah. And so the past few aphorisms have been speaking a lot about this, focusing on our faults, and that why it's better for us than having something unveiled from us from the unseen. Now we are the ones that are veiled from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of these different things so that you and I can take this seriously. Because as long as we remain in that state satisfied with ourselves, we're not going to tread the path because we don't think that we need to. And so one of the ways that we can look at this is a story that we've heard our teachers mention on multiple occasions, where there was someone who went to 2 different halaqas, and he wanted to see the response of both. One halaqah was the ones that were focusing a little bit more on outward knowledge. He threw something in the halaqah. People turned around. They started to get upset. Started to say things that, to the person and so forth. And then he threw something in the other halaqah. And their response was very different. Most of them didn't even turn. And they were a little bit startled as Allah, Allah. They just remembered Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it was a very different response. And one of the things we heard our teachers say is that those who focus more upon the inward, and balance is really what we want. But if in focusing that on the inward, some of the things outwardly that we should know that we fall short in, from the blessing of focusing more on the inward, is that ultimately doors will open up where we'll even have a deeper understanding than people that focus a little bit more on the outward. And ultimately what we want is balance. And it was for this reason when Sheikh Abdurrahman al-Saqaf saw his son Imam al-Mihdar, who had a photographic memory, memorizing the books of the fuqaha, that he told him that, like in modern measurements, it would be like saying that 1 gram of knowledge of the heart is greater than that many kilograms, or even you could say that a ton of knowledge, that of the outward. And it's not belittling the outward in any way. We have to have outward knowledge, but it's showing the precious nature of inward knowledge. And in the end, after you learn your basic creed, and after you learn what it is that you know to protect your belief, after it is that you learn the basic ahkam of what you need to live your life, which you have to do, a lot of the other legal issues that you're learning, which you should learn them so that you can help other people also follow the sacred law. But a lot of them, you're not going to ever come into contact with. So if you read like a larger manual of any school of fiqh, the vast majority of those masail you're not going to come into contact with. And it's important that we study them. And it's important we have scholars who know them to clarify. But when it comes to this knowledge, you need it every day of your life. And not only do you need it every day of your life, you need it every hour of your life. Not only do you need it every hour, you need it every minute. Not only every minute, you need it in every single moment, because the heart is constantly oscillating and fluctuating. And that is what is meant by this knowledge, is more that is heavier. And this is the knowledge of, after we know what we need to know by way of creed and ahkam, is that we prepare the heart to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what he means by this statement, and then ends it by saying, فَأَيُّ عِلْمِ عَالَمْ يَرْضَى نَفْسِهِ وَأَيُّ جَهْلٍ لِجَاهِلٍ لَا يَرْضَى عَنْ نَفْسِهِ. And he puts into question any knowledge that a learned man has who is self-satisfied. So think about what this means and the implications in our society. and all of the PhDs, and what are the intelligentsia doing with their intelligence in our world? What corporations are they serving? What purposes are they serving? What self-interest do they have? Where is their intelligence? The vast majority of intelligence and all of the brain drain in the Muslim world, where all the intelligent people end up getting schooled in Western schools, at the elite schools, from sometimes the middle school level, but at least at the high school level, and then at the university and postgraduate. Where is that all going? And what purpose is it serving? And how much of it is good? How much of it is spent towards a good human cause, let alone religious? And then we wonder why we're in the position that we're in. Look at the brain drain in the Muslim world, and where all of the smart people go study. And look what they do with their intelligence. And the few, who knows, the fraction of 1% will actually use it for religion. And again, we want to know why we're in the situation we're in. And what he's saying here is that what knowledge can someone have if they're full of themselves? And they think that they have everything that they need, and they don't think that they need working on. And they're in a complete state of heedlessness and just following their desires, because their desires are controlling their intellect in ways that they don't realize. It's very subtle. And then many of whom are just openly doing all different types of ma'asiyah, and many of them in a very conniving, demonic way that they've almost like sold themselves to shaitan. Ayun, what kind of knowledge is that? And then وَأَيُّ جَهْلٍ لِجَهْلٍ, for these people that think these other people are ignorant, and they don't have, if we expand that meaning, what I just mentioned, to an outward knowledge, doesn't even relate to ahkam. Academic knowledge or knowledge of something that you can do in the world or something that you can build or whatever. What kind of knowledge is that really, if we're ignorant of that? Or even if we fall a little bit short, and we shouldn't fall short in relation to what we need to know outwardly. But if we're people that are not self-satisfied and we're actively working on bettering our heart so that our heart becomes filled with the love of Allah. And you might have someone who, subhanAllah, everyone thinks is a fool and just no one cares about in society. And they're poor. They live off $1 a day. But their heart is filled with the love of Allah. And they might even have a lot of worship outwardly. They might not even know a lot outwardly. And some of you have mothers or fathers or aunts or uncles or grandparents like that. Some of you have seen people like that with your own two eyes. And there's people like that even within our community. Still, from the bounty of Allah Ta'ala. What are they really missing? What jahl do they really have? If they have the true knowledge, which is knowledge of the self, which leads ultimately to the knowledge of our Lord. This is how we want to be. And so may Allah Ta'ala give us tawfiq to learn these meanings and to put them into practice. Ya Arhamar Rahmeen, and bless us with thabat and firmness upon this path until the day that we meet our Lord. And may we put our heads down and fixate our gaze on what it is that we need to do, and see that nothing is between us and drawing near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, other than that we fixate our gaze on the goal, and we don't let anything come between us and drawing near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah ta'ala give us tawfiq and bless us in all of our affairs, and bless us to be people of ta'ah, of obedience. Bless us to be people of awareness and wakefulness, and bless us to be people of temperance, and be people who constantly work on themselves until the day that we meet our Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala. May we be gifted as a result in this world with knowledge of Him and the experiences that He blesses the elect of the awliya and the salihin with, and then bless us to also receive the fruit of that in the hereafter. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.